The Bengal Famine of 1770. Hello curious people. In a time when staying home is the new normal, today we present you the Bengal Famine of 1770. The Bengal Famine of 1770 was a catastrophic famine that completely changed the scenario of rural Bengal. Coming in the wake of the Maratha invasions and the unparalleled revenue exactions of Siraj-ud-Daulah, Mir Qasim and East India Company, the famine must have had many Bengalis wondering whether a darker age could come, or the wrath of the gods had descended upon their society. In an agricultural country like India, the occurrence of famine was not an unusual phenomenon. The statement of Megasthenes that famine never visited India can hardly be described as accurate. The famine of 1770, which occurred during the governorship of Cartier, was an unprecedented calamity that struck Bengal. The Great Famine, which raged in great severity throughout 1770, affected most districts of Bengal: Purnea, Nadia, Rajshahi, Birbhum, Panchit, northern and western parts of Burdwan, Bhagalpur, Rajmahal, Hooghly, Jessore, Malda and 24 Parganas. Purnea district was the worst sufferer. Ducarel, the supervisor of Purnea, reported that 200,000 people perished in that district alone. He reported the famine continued for about 12 months, in a severity hardly to be paralleled in the history of any age of the country. R.P. has analyzed the causes of the famine, and successfully brought out the relation between the famine and the economic drain. Before the 1770 famine, there was a British consensus that Bengal's economy was deteriorating. The signs were evident in the severe shortage of coins, shrinking of Bengal's internal trade, and the decline in the net land revenue collections. Richard Becher, resident at Murshidabad, lamented in 1769 on the economic decline of the Diwani territories. The 1770 famine only confirmed and deepened the crisis, it did not create it. Various other interpretations regarding the failure of British policies have also come up in due course of research. Fault for the famine is now often attributed to the British East India Company policies in Bengal. As a trading body, its first priority was to maximize its profit, which came from land tax and trade tariffs. In the April of 1770, the company announced that the land tax of the following year was to be raised by 10%. The company is also criticized for forbidding the hoarding of rice. This prevented the traders and dealers from holding in reserves that in other times would have helped the population to tide over the crisis period. By the time of the famine, the company and its agents had established monopoly in grain trading. The company had no plans for dealing with the grain shortage. Actions were only taken so far they affected the mercantile and trading classes. It certainly seems strange that a province like Bengal, which had 3 harvests a year, should ever have been afflicted by famine. The failure of one harvest may lead to sufferings, but under ordinary circumstances, there could not be a famine, unless there were at least 2 successive crops failures. The great harvest of the year is the rice crop in December, then follows the spring harvest with its pulse crop in April, and lastly, the autumn harvest in September, producing a coarse rice upon which the lower classes of the community mainly subsist. In the discussed famine, the winter harvest was occasioned by premature ceasing of rains. In the usual years, the rains commence in the latter part of June and cease in the middle of October. If they stop before the middle of September, the great rice crop, which should ripen in December, withers up and dies. It was to this cause to which the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 could be ascribed to. In order to analyze this cause thoroughly, a clear picture of the weather and crops of 1769 to 1770 is needed. The Annals of Rural Bengal by Sir William Wilson Hunter is one of the most important primary sources throwing light on the subject. Hunter writes in his book that in the cold weather of 1769, Bengal was visited by a famine, whose ravages 2 generations failed to repair. He says, in the early part of 1769, high prices had ruled owing to the partial failure of crops in 1768, but the scarcity had not been so severe as to materially affect the government revenues. The rains in 1769, although deficient in northern districts, seemed for a time to promise relief. In the delta, they had been so abundant as to cause temporary loss from inundation, and during the succeeding year of general famine, the whole of southeast Bengal uttered no complaint. The September harvest indeed was sufficient. But, in that month, the periodical rains prematurely ceased, and the crop, which depended on them for existence, withered. Letters from the President and the Council to the Court of Directors in November 1769 shows that Mr. John Cartier, who was succeeded by Mr. Verhulst, signed the only serious notification of the approaching famine. In December, Mr. Verhulst laid down his office, and charge was taken over by Mr. Cartier. In the fourth week of the same month, one district was suffering so badly that little Remissions inland tax had to be made. New hopes had also arisen, for the spring crop now covered the fields and promised a speedy, although a scanty, relief. Moreover, it was ascertained that both the banks of the Ganges in the north of the province had yielded abundant barley and wheat harvests. In spite of that, people suffered intensely. About 1/3 of the inhabitants perished in the once bountiful province of Purnea, and in other parts, the misery is equal. Although in the stifling summer of 1770, the people went on dying, day and night torrents of famishes poured into the great cities. At an early period of the year, a pestilence had broken out. In March, smallpox ravaged Murshidabad. The streets were blocked up with promiscuous heaps of the dying and the dead. The multitude of the mangled and the festering corpses at length threatened the existence of citizens. In 1770, the rainy season brought relief, and before the end of September, the province reaped an abundant harvest. But the relief came too late to avert the depopulation. Starving and shelterless, crowds crawled despairingly in vain from one deserted village to another in search of food and shelter. From the rain.the endemics incident to the season were thus spread over the whole country. Sir George Campbell, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, says that the only parts of Bengal which seemed to have escaped were the districts of Bukarganj and Chittagong. With the exception of this small southeastern tract, the famine involved in greater or lesser degree the whole of Bengal and Bihar. Sir Campbell writes, in tracing the course of the famine, I find that the first alarm came from Bihar. The following season commenced very badly. On 28 July, the resident in Bihar reported that up to the time, we had only in some parts a few showers, and those so very trifling that little benefit has been received from them. The grain sown some times ago is entirely spoilt. On 1 August, he repeated the same tale. Grain has within few days risen to a prodigious price and continues to rise, as there is not only the greatest probability of losing the entire harvest, but a general famine to be dreaded, he says. It has been found that, in North Bengal, the season was especially bad. From September onwards, the march of the calamity seems to have been without subsiding. In October, no rain fell. On 23 November 1769, the Bengal government formally reported to the Court of Directors the prevailing distress. Meanwhile, in North Bengal and other districts also, the evil was becoming very great, especially in Purnea. In early February 1770, a little rain seems to have fallen in some districts, but it was too insufficient for any material good. From that time to the end of May, the drought was universal. Not a drop of rain fell, and the country became more and more parched and distressed. After June and July, things reached their climax. All through August, the famine in Bengal continued with unabated severity. In September, there seemed to be some symptoms of the calamity dying away, and the dispatches dwell more on all that the country has suffered than the gloomy anticipations. In October, things are decidedly better as grain is much cheaper. On 14 December, the government informs the Court of Directors that the famine has entirely ceased. This was the detailed account of the course of the famine as provided by Sir George Campbell. Fortunately enough, abundance returned to Bengal as suddenly as famine had swooped down upon it. On the Christmas Eve, the council in Calcutta wrote home to the Court of Directors that the famine had entirely ceased. In 1771, the harvests again proved plentiful. It was as if nature exerted herself to the utmost to repair the damage she had done. The reports of enormous mortality and needless misery in Bengal fueled criticism of the company's rapacious revenue collection, corruption, extortion and monopolistic trading practices of its servants. To many it seemed the height of infamy that the company, even when the famine was at its height, showed more concern for its revenues than for the people's distress. The outcry in England over the famine merged with more general criticism of the company's conduct and administration. In the minds of many European commentators, the Bengal famine of 1770 was a natural disaster, but in more senses than are usually intended by them. For those who served or defended the East India Company, it was convenient to believe that the famine had been caused by a natural phenomenon. The Bengal famine was perhaps the first Asian disaster to have an impact on Europe. But the famine did little to stimulate a more genuine understanding of the country and its people. Historians regarding the consequences of the famine have done various estimates. These estimates include the assertion that 1/3 of Bengal's population perished, that 1/3 of the cultivated area was abandoned, that 2/3 of Bengal's aristocracy was ruined by the famine. Estimates of both pre-famine population and famine mortality were matters of wild guesses, stabs in the dark. James Rennell estimated in 1781 that Bengal, Bihar and Orissa had 10 million inhabitants. Harry Verhulst stated in the same year that the population was at least 7 million. James Grant in 1786 estimated that this area contained 10 million people. Subsequent historians have raised their estimates of population. Both Sinha and Pellegrino estimated that close to 10 million people perished, implying a pre-famine population of at least 30 million. In the end, I would like to thank you for watching us, and I would like to invite you to subscribe and like our channel.